What happens when one of the most silent, image-controlled first ladies in U.S. history decides to take a bold public swing at a firebrand congresswoman? And what if that move backfires live in court because of just one sentence spoken by one witness in under 10 seconds? Now, this isn't political theater. It's a real legal battle, and the fallout, it's bigger than anyone expected. Let me show you how a single moment shattered silence, exposed power, and changed two legacies forever. When Melania Trump filed a lawsuit against Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, it wasn't a press stunt. It wasn't a rumor or political posturing. It was real. And the moment the news broke, Washington shook. The First Lady of the United States was suing a sitting member of Congress for defamation, and no one saw it coming. What followed wasn't just a high-profile legal case. It became a defining cultural moment. And in the end, all it took was 9 seconds. A single sentence from one witness to collapse the entire foundation of the case. But to understand how everything unraveled so quickly, you first have to understand the two women who stood on opposite ends of this explosive courtroom battle. Melania Trump, elegant, reserved, and almost ghost-like in Washington's brutal political arena, was someone who had spent most of her time in the public eye controlling her image. She rarely gave interviews. She carefully chose her causes. She didn't dive into controversy. Jasmine Crockett, the exact opposite. A freshman congresswoman from Texas with a law degree and a voice that refused to be silenced. She was known for playing it safe. She had earned a reputation for asking tough questions and speaking directly, sometimes too directly, depending on who you asked. The stage was set when Crockett made a public comment, a comment that Melania's legal team said crossed the line, suggesting the former First Lady had been involved in behind-the-scenes financial dealings during her husband's presidency. Crockett didn't whisper it. She didn't hint. She said it plainly. And for once, Melania Trump didn't remain silent. She sued. The legal filing was crisp, direct. Melania's name's front and center. The allegations defamation. That Crockett's remarks were damaging, baseless, and intended to tarnish her reputation. The news spread fast. Reporters scrambled. Legal analysts speculated. People on both sides of the political divide braced for impact. And outside the federal courthouse in Dallas, the lines were drawn. Supporters of Melania waved American flags and held signs defending her dignity. Others came to stand with Crockett, saying this was more than just a lawsuit. It was an attempt to silence a voice that had become too powerful to ignore. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy, like history was about to happen. Melania Trump, dressed in beige, sat with her team, serene, composed, unflinching, a portrait of silence. Jasmine Crockett, fiery as ever, sat upright, eyes sharp, arms often folded, ready for a fight. This wasn't just a trial about reputation. It was about control. Who controls the narrative? Who gets to speak, and at what cost? Opening statements made the stakes clear. Melania's lead attorney, a smooth-talking man named Philip Ransom, told the jury, "This case is not about politics. This is about accountability, about protecting the dignity and the name of a woman who served as First Lady of the United States." But Crockett's defense attorney, Linda Garvey, had a different message. This trial is about power. It's about what happens when someone in power doesn't like being questioned. It's about silencing a woman who dared to speak out. Jasmine Crockett was no stranger to pressure. Before she became a congresswoman, she was a public defender in Dallas, often the only line of defense for clients with no money, no power, and no voice. People in those neighborhoods didn't just respect her, they trusted her. And that trust didn't come from TV appearances or social media. It came from her showing up day after day, case after case. When she took the stand in her own defense, she didn't back down. She looked at the jury and said, "I said what I said because the people who sent me to Washington didn't send me there to stay quiet. They sent me to ask questions, to speak out, even if those questions make the powerful uncomfortable." The jury took note. But as the trial went on, something began to shift. Melania's attorneys presented a strong case, bringing in media analysts, PR experts, consultants. They argued that Crockett's comments weren't just political, they were reckless, that they spread quickly across television, social media, and blogs, damaging the First Lady's image in ways that couldn't be undone. But Crockett's team fought back. They argued that public figures are subject to scrutiny, that elected officials must be free to speak about those in power. That truth isn't defamation. Still, things remained tense, tight, almost evenly matched, until Robert Klein walked into the courtroom. His name wasn't on the radar, at least not for the general public, but for people deep inside political circles. It hit hard. Klein had served quietly as a senior advisor during the Trump administration, his job involving negotiations on large infrastructure and international contracts. He had never spoken publicly, but now under oath, he was being asked a simple question. Was Melania Trump involved in closed-door negotiations during the administration? And he answered with just one word. Yes. Silence. Total silence. And then chaos. Reporters lunged for their phones. Sketch artists dropped their pencils. One journalist pen hit the courtroom floor and echoed louder than any gasp. Because in just 9 seconds, the central claim of Melania Trump's lawsuit had been undermined. She wasn't just a ceremonial figure. According to Klein, she wasn't on the sidelines at all. She had participated. She had advocated. She had influence. And that meant Jasmine Crockett's comments weren't baseless after all. They were rooted in something real. Melania's lawyers jumped up. They objected. They called it hearsay. They tried to stop the bleeding, but the damage had already been done. Klein was calm, unshaken, and when pressed by the defense, he doubled down. She wasn't just in the room, he said. She gave input. She pushed for certain terms. It didn't matter what followed. The headlines were already being written. That night, every major network played the clip over and over and over. Melania Trump directly involved in secret negotiations, said one anchor. Testimony flips trial upside down, said another. In the streets outside the courthouse, the tone had changed. Crockett's supporters cheered. Her critics grew quieter. Even the people who hadn't paid much attention before were now asking, was this lawsuit really about defamation or about damage control? Inside her team's conference room, Melania sat frozen. Her lawyers scribbled frantic notes. One aide whispered, "We've lost the narrative." And for a woman who had spent her entire public life controlling the narrative, that was a devastating realization. Meanwhile, Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't celebrate on camera, but her eyes told the story. For weeks, she had been painted as reckless. Now her courage was being seen for what it was. Refusal to bend in the face of power. The fallout was immense. Commentators debated whether the lawsuit had been a mistake from the beginning. Some argued that Melania had walked straight into a trap, that in trying to silence Crockett, she'd handed her a national microphone. Others defended the former First Lady. She was trying to protect her name. One pundit said, "What would you do if someone publicly suggested you were involved in shady dealings?" But public opinion had begun to shift in a diner in Oklahoma. Truckers sat around a table watching the coverage. One said, "I never thought she was part of all that." Another replied, "They all are. They just hide it better." Back inside the courtroom, the final days of the trial were intense but inevitable. Closing arguments arrived. Melania's team insisted words matter, reputations matter. We can't let politicians smear private citizens and walk away. But Crockett's team reminded the jury of something more powerful. "This trial is not about a single statement," said Linda Garvey. "It's about whether our elected officials are allowed to speak without fear, whether the truth, even uncomfortable truth, has a place in our democracy." The jury deliberated for just over a day, and when they returned, the verdict was read. "We, the jury, find in favor of the defendant, Representative Jasmine Crockett." The courtroom erupted, not in loud cheers, but in that collective gasp you hear when something massive finally lands. Melania sat still, her composure held, but her eyes, just for a moment, betrayed something else. Regret, shock, defeat, maybe all three. Jasmine Crockett. She exhaled, closed her eyes, put one hand over her heart, and whispered something to her attorney that no one could quite hear. Outside, microphones waited, cameras flashed. She stepped to the podium and said, "This was never about me. This was about our right to speak, to ask hard questions, to hold power accountable. If we lose that right, we lose the very core of our democracy." Her words traveled across cable news, across social media, into classrooms, workplaces, and dinner tables across America. For Melania, there was no press conference, no follow-up statement, just silence. And sometimes silence says more than anything else. In the end, the lawsuit that was meant to silence Jasmine Crockett had made her louder than ever. She had stood her ground and in doing so reminded a country that truth isn't always polite, isn't always neat, but it matters. And if one sentence from one witness could change the course of history in a courtroom, imagine what happens when more people start speaking up. If you believe stories like this matter, if you believe that voices who speak truth to power should be heard, then subscribe, because we're just getting started. It